Namaste and pranam, everyone. My name is Swami, and I'm a recent graduate from UT Dallas. I'm honored to welcome you to Understanding Hinduphobia 2025, serving as the MC for Session 1. This conference is especially meaningful to me because as a college student, it is critical to recognize how prevalent Hinduphobia can be even within academia. In fact, the first Understanding Hinduphobia conference in Rutgers 2021 helped identify such Hinduphobia, even playing a role in helping me find a good college fit. Hinduphobia manifests in several forms, and today we will be discussing the importance of preserving the Hindu voice in the face of erasure. So thank you for being here and joining us in this important conversation. Our first speaker will examine how the English language media coverage of the Ram Mandir inauguration in Ayodhya reflects patterns of selective omission and bias. The consecration of this temple was a historic moment for Hindus worldwide, yet much of the media coverage failed to present the full history of the site. Many reports framed the event primarily through the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992, often omitting archaeological findings and centuries of disputes over the land. This selective storytelling reinforces the common Hinduphobic trope of Hindus as aggressors while erasing the historical record of temple destruction and dispossession. To explore this issue, we are honored to welcome Matt McDermott Ji, the Senior Director of Communications at the Hindu American Foundation. Matt Ji has worked extensively in media relations, shaping public discourse around Hindu issues and advocating for fair, accurate reporting. Today, he will present a comparative analysis of English language media coverage of the Ram Mandir inauguration, revealing how omission itself can be a tool of erasure. So please join me in welcoming Matt G.
Namaste, everyone. I am humbled to be going first. I was not quite aware I was going to be doing that. Thank you all for joining us. That introduction was quite extensive and gets to the heart of what I was doing here. So let me set this up if I can share my screen so you have something to look at other than the hotel room I am in at the moment. Let's see if we can do this. Oh. Okay, let's see. Can everyone, I don't know, give me a thumbs up on what screen you're sharing, I'm seeing here. Don't know. I'm sorry for this. We have technical here. Let's try this again. I want this one. Okay, there we go. Okay, so basically, this research will be presented on the Hindu American website. If it's not actually published right now, it should be in the next couple of days. What I did was last year, when the Ram Mandir was being inaugurated, I was interested in the coverage of it because we had something we had looked at HAF for some time. And the thing that occurred to me is having an interest in history is how much of the coverage just ignored the fact that there was archaeological excavations done and seemed to think history started with Babri Masjid just existing. So I went in and looked at to see if this was borne out by the actual facts of this in the English language media, or was this just an assumption from what I'd happened to see. I was really going into this trying to be open-minded about it in the sense of I wasn't sure what I was going to find. When I proposed this, there was something in the back of my head saying maybe there won't be bias. As it turns out, spoiler alert, there was. So let's move this along. So the spoiler alert is that of English language media, Al Jazeera and Time produce the most negative coverage of anyone by far. As the introduction stated, the key issues across all media, and this actually goes for media that framed it positively as well, was the omission of archaeological evidence, selective framing of history, and biased language in tone, often very subtle. So in the articles that I was looking at, there was little mention of the history of the site prior to the construction of what became known as Babri Masjid, what happened there in the centuries between that construction and the demolition that occurred in the early 90s, or the archaeology. So nobody also mentioned one of the goals of that archaeology, was to determine if assertions that Babri Masjid was in fact built over the remains of a destroyed Hindu temple or any sort of previous religious building were backed up by evidence, as well as to establish more broadly what the site had been used for prior to the early 16th century. So let's jump into this. These were the main questions. So in looking at these articles, was the history and archaeology of the site omitted from the coverage? Was the history presented done accurately? And was the reporting favoring one perspective or another? So in terms of methodology, I looked at the top 50 Google search results for, quote, Ram Mandir Ayodhya, published between December 1st, 2023 and February 3rd, 2024. English language, no geographical restrictions. So I'm looking at all English language media across the globe. I did it from Los Angeles, California. I was using the latest version of Safari, latest Mac OS available at the time on a MacBook Air. I point those out because search is fickle, and if you use a different computer, different operating system, even from a different geographical location, the exact results you get might be different. I categorize articles on tone on a scale from 1 to 5, negative, somewhat negative, neutral, somewhat positive, and positive. The categorization I did was based on the language used to describe the events surrounding the opening of the Mandir, the history of the site, and the reaction to it. This characterization was done subjectively. I admit this entirely, making judgments based on the decade and a half plus as a media professional, working as a writer, journalist, commentator, editor, now senior director of communications at HAF. I think with that background and experience, it's pretty easy for me to assess the intent behind different phrasings and different word choices. In almost any situation, I can figure out why someone chose one versus another, or have a good guess at it, or at least come up with alternative phrasings that could push it one way or the other. I also looked at them trying to erase my previous knowledge of the situation and put my mindset in that of a reader who's coming to the situation for the first time and how an article might be taken. So once I did that, I went back, and of the top 50 articles, those outlets which produced the most biased coverage one way or the other, I wanted to go back and look at and take a full look at all the coverage, not just the results that came into the top 50 search results, the articles that did so, to all the media coverage that they did and their outlet between those same dates. So in doing this, sorry, manipulating screens here. Here's some examples just to go into the phrasing part of it. Examples of alternative phrasing. Calling the construction of the Ram Mandir, quote, controversial, I believe is a neutral description. Objectively, there is controversy around the issue, regardless of what side you come down on or no side at all. Calling the construction, however, divisive is making a judgment about the nature of that controversy and ultimately taking the viewpoint of opposition as the correct one. Other examples, saying the BJP, these are all examples, by the way, of that I'm pulling from the articles. Saying the BJP and the Prime Minister Modi are being motivated by Hindu nationalism is objectively true. They would probably all say this by themselves. This is a self-identified motivation. Describing Modi, however, as authoritarian or, quote, a strong man is a judgment and a counterfactual one based upon the generally held definitions of each. Whatever you think of the BJP or Modi, I do not believe that if you look up the dictionary definitions of authoritarian or strongman, either one is actually accurate. Describing the BJP as motivated by a, quote, supremacist ideology or, quote, Hindu fascism is also a judgment and one that runs counter to their own statements of motivation. And again, I believe commonly held definitions of those, unless you define fascism along critical theory lines, which is basically anything center left or to the right of that. So continuing on, I judged these articles by a number of questions, yes or no. Did they mention any history of the site prior to the construction of Babri Masjid? Did they present a reasonably full and accurate history of the site, mention any investigations by the Archaeological Survey of India, mention that the courts ordered a land grant for the construction of a new mosque as part of all the court proceedings. We'll get to these potential limitations. There are some. I am fully aware of these. I did not look at all the published articles by all the outlets. I only went into the articles coming into the top 50 results, and of those deemed most biased by the initial analysis, the full outlet, the full work of those outlets. Also taking into account, or not taking into account, I should say, of these articles, I don't look at or have any way of really judging which ones of these were served to the public through social media. The public generally consumes most of their news media through algorithms produced by social media, and I have no way of actually going in and looking and saying, no real way of which one of these articles were served to people. This is simply Google search results. And also, I will admit, this is a subjective analysis of one person. I did not have the time nor resources to perhaps recruit a statistically relevant set of people to read these articles and then survey them on what they took away from the articles. This is my looking at these articles from a media professional's perspective to see what I got out of them. So those overall examples were from the generalized examples of alternative phrasings, were from the articles, but here's some more examples of specific biased tone. I should point out that, as you can see on the current slide, the subtly biased phrasing was almost all negative. There was very few subtly positive phrasing at all. So some examples here. This is from the New York Times, January 22nd, 2024. Quote, Mr. Modi, now the country's prime minister, inaugurated the Ram Temple in Ayodhya on Monday, the crowning achievement of a national movement aimed at establishing Hindu supremacy in India by rallying the country's Hindu majority across castes and tribes. So why is this negative? The national movement being referred to here is Hindutva, which defines the word Hindu not in contemporary religious terms, but in cultural terms. Proponents of Hindutva believe encompasses essentially anyone who lives in India and also honors the nation as a cultural homeland. It does center the Dharmic traditions, faiths. Apologies, I'm coming to you from Delhi and it is later in the day for me, but also explicitly includes members of those faiths originating outside of India. It's simply false to describe Hindutva as a Hindu supremacist ideology or movement. It's also false to describe the goals of the BJP, the party of Prime Minister Modi, as being rooted in Hindu supremacy or attempting to establish Hindu supremacy. So here, I rewrote it for you. This would be probably a more accurate way of saying the same exact thing. This is my wording. Mr. Modi, now the country's prime minister, inaugurated the Ram Temple in Ayodhya on Monday. The change here, the crowning achievement of a national movement aimed, it believes, at addressing the concerns of the nation's Hindu majority, long perceived as being sidelined under previous governments, and uniting the nation across castes, tribes, and religions. There are other ways of framing that, but that was my first go at it, and I think it would be more accurate. So, of course, even in that phrasing, you can debate the effectiveness of the BJP in what they say they're doing, but such a description is accurate and neutral in terms of what they say they are trying to do. So another example, here's from Time. Quote, it also cements his legacy as one of the country's most consequential leaders, in particular one who is helping to transform India from a secular democracy into an invalidly Hindu nation. Why is this negative? The part of this passage after the M dash is a piece of analysis presented as a fact in an article not labeled as opinion, analysis, or commentary, a fact that's highly debatable, particularly in that no one in the BJP has seriously proposed ending secular democracy in India. It also muddles the scene in that, given the huge demographic majority of Hindus in India, the nation is already avowedly Hindu, even as the state of India has been avowedly secular since its creation in independence in 1947. So we can keep going on from Time again, because Time's a particularly egregious example. Quote, this is from January 22nd, 2024. Quote, for Hindus, the site marks the birthplace of Lord Ram, but the site is also revered by India's Muslims for once housing the 16th century Babri Masjid, a monument of faith for Indian Muslims that stood on the site for centuries before it was razed by Hindu nationalist mob in 1992. So this paragraph is by the same author as the previous example. It wasn't the purpose of the research to go into specific bylines, so I'm omitting that. In a different article, this shows paragraph, sorry, same author, different article, I was mistaken. Paragraph in a different article shows the sort of selective telling of history, the selective framing of the conversation. The history of the site of Babri Masjid and the new Ram Mandir is readily available. As we'll get into this paper, a number of very detailed and accurate historical timelines of the site have been published. The history is not obscure. A writer failing to mention the full history of the site is a conscious choice, a choice to discount history as a factor worth discussing. It is true that the Babri Masjid, quote, stood on the site for centuries before it was razed by a Hindu nationalist mob in 1992. However, what is not said is that the Babri Masjid was built according to the traditional Hindu account, now validated by archaeological research, over the ruins of a temple destroyed by Muslims to construct the mosque. The, quote, monument of faith for Muslims, archaeology indicates, was built directly over a monument of faith for Hindus and one with a longer legacy of veneration. We can't ignore this fact. Okay, so we'll get on to the sources and there'll be less talking by me and editorializing. Let's look at the sources. So of the top 25 search results, I'm breaking it down into 25 and 50 because it's illustrative in some ways. CNN comes to the top, 6 articles, Reuters 4, Al Jazeera 3, and so on. If anybody wants this, I will give my email at the end and you can have this presentation if you like, and all these graphs are in the paper that will be published. Interesting to note that the percentage of articles in here is 80% news articles, 12% dedicated history and timelines, and 8% commentary. Top 50 results reveal something a little bit different. Al Jazeera and ties with CNN, they both now have 6. And as you notice in here, a lot of Indian news sources rise up into this, including some odd ones like Men's XP that somehow managed to get up into the top 50 results. Country of origin on the left, that is the top 50. USA from English language media makes up 68% of the results, India 8. But then if you go to top 50, India rises up significantly, balancing out everything, overtaking the United States and changing the sources significantly. Moving on into tone, the red, for the sake of simplicity of graphs, I've combined negative and somewhat negative and positive, somewhat positive into the same categories. And red is negative, green is positive, neutral is gray. So of this, you can see CNN in the top 25, CNN had 50% either way, negative, somewhat negative, and then neutral. Reuters actually had 25% positive. Indian Express had 100% positive. I believe that was, off the top of my head, I'd have to check the spreadsheet, but that was an opinion piece praising the opening. Voice of America, which is an official government USA publication, was against it. Which was interesting. New York Times, Time magazine, also 100% positive. Interesting to note here, because Al Jazeera comes out as a source of significant bias in this, is that in the top 25, only 33% are actually biased. The rest is fairly factual, neutral reporting. Top 50, things change a little bit. Al Jazeera is coming up into this, but there's still 34-66. What's revealed by a deeper dive into Al Jazeera is not yet revealed. And again, let's see if there's anything to pull out in that. AP, interesting, held up as a bastion of neutrality generally in the United States. And frankly, some fairly boring factual writing that comes out with a positive framing of this. It was very interesting. By tone, somewhat revealing. India 50% positive, 50% neutral. Indian origin media had many more opinion pieces talking about the opening of the Mandir in positive terms. Top 50 does not, it changes things a little bit, but it's not that different. Here's where it comes into, and where my initial assumption about omitting history of the site, history not being important to reporters, comes into it. And this is across all sources, regardless of tone. 56% of all sources mention no history of the site at all prior to Babri Masjid. It is as if the mosque sprang up there like a mushroom. Of the 88% gave no full history. 90% did not think it worthy that the Archaeological Survey of India actually investigated the site, regardless of what they actually said about it or found, mentioned nothing of it at all. And almost 60% did not mention at all that in compensation for the destruction of Babri Masjid, land was granted for a construction of a mosque. So in taking a deeper dive, I went in and, taking a look at the most biased sources. There were no positively biased sources that rose into this, so this is all negative. And over the same time period, Al Jazeera produced 12 articles, CNN 11, Time 4, The Guardian 3, New York Times 3. Time was the most fully negative of any publication, with 3 out of the 4 articles that they published being negative. 2 of those were entirely negative opinion pieces coming out strongly against it with some of the most anti-Hindu rhetoric one can imagine. The Guardian, all the articles were negative or somewhat negative. And interestingly, worthwhile of note is The Guardian was the only English language publication in the entire world whose search results made it into the top 50. It took an official editorial position against the temple opening, which compared to some of the other things, I at least give them credit for stating their opinions openly rather than just hiding it in under pretenses of objectivity. CNN, half of the top coverage was negative or somewhat negative. But when you looked at, all the coverage outside of the top 50 search results, it was neutral. So some of the top results of CNN were not so neutral, not so favorable about it, and included much biased language. But looking at overall, CNN did not do as bad a job as the top 50 results would indicate. New York Times, favorite punching bag of many people in the Hindu American community for not seeing India favorably in any way and never seeing a Hindu subject it did not like to sensationalize. 2 somewhat negative articles, 1 neutral. So I don't know what to say about that. It was not the worst thing. It was not the best thing. So Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera deserves its own topic in this entire conference. So 66% of the articles produced by Al Jazeera on this topic were negative or somewhat negative. Every single article outside the top 50 results were negative or somewhat negative. 75% mentioned nothing of the site pre-Babri. 83% did not present a full history of the site. 92% of the articles did not mention that ASI investigated the site. 67% of articles did not mention the court-ordered mosque land grant. Some of those stats are consistent with other publications, but I have them here for a sense of completion of what Al Jazeera was actually doing. So it's clear to me that Al Jazeera took an editorial stance against the opening of the new Ram Mandir without openly stating so. There are a number of reasons for this in terms of implementation. This could either be directly from the top down editorially at some level in their chain of editorial production, or it could be indirectly through the people assigned or hired to cover India and this topic. I have no real insight into that. I don't have insight into the internal workings of Al Jazeera at that level at all. The thing is this was all done while claiming to be straightforward news reporting. As I said before, at least The Guardian had the courage of their convictions to state openly the editorial stance that they were taking. Even though I disagree with them, at least I admire, being honest. So a bit of discussion here before we wrap this up. The 90% of the articles, regardless of overall tone, don't mention the work of the ASI as a huge failing, as this provides what I believe to be crucial context to discussing this issue. Knowing the archaeology changes the entire narrative. It's a crucial fact to include in making a full assessment of the site historically. Knowing the results of this work significantly balances the narrative and contextualizes the movement to establish a new Ram Mandir. It takes the motivations of those people wanting a new temple from being rooted solely in traditional religious belief that the site is the birthplace of Lord Ram, without concrete historical evidence to support this, to a belief that's supported by archaeology showing that some sort of dharmic worship happened at the site, even if the historicity of Lord Ram being born there is beyond the scope of archaeology as a subject. It may not justify mob destruction of Babri Masjid in many people's eyes, but to me, it strongly qualifies the condemnation of such violence. If such violence is a response to previous violence of a very similar nature done centuries before, that is surely a different thing than instigating violence for the first time. If there was a temple on the site destroyed to build the mosque, then the events of 1992 were a reclamation of a site of worship destroyed in the 16th century, reclamation through extrajudicial violence, which is widely condemned in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, but nevertheless reclamation. If there was not a temple prior to Babri, then it is the erroneous belief of Hindus leading to the destruction of a Muslim place of worship. Those are very, very different stories to tell, and the archaeology supports the former. In the first instance, the building of the new temple is restoration of something that was destroyed centuries ago. In the second instance, the building of the new temple is based on erroneous belief and victimizing the Muslim community based on that erroneous belief. So, some surprising findings to wrap this up. The BBC was neutral in tone. I didn't mention it in here, but astute people who saw the graphs and go on to read the paper, BBC was neutral. That runs counter to what seems to be in the community, a perception of bias and sensationalization towards India and Hindus from that media source. I think that is true across much of their coverage. However, in this specific instance, that was not the case. Coverage of Indian news media was nearly universally neutral in tone. I was expecting going into this that there would be more of a positive slant to Indian news media. It was not at all. The vast majority was, in fact, neutral and went into great detail in interesting ways about the economics of the site, all sorts of things that was left out of Western media in this. I don't fault Western media for that because as you get farther away geographically from any event, you're not going to have the level of detail that local media does. So with that, I will advance to my final slide. That is my email, and that is our website. As I said, the research will be published shortly if it is not there already. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you all for listening to me. I hope it did not go over. I did not have a clock. And namaste, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Madji, for that insightful presentation. Your analysis highlights just how much the framing of a story, what is included and what is left out, affects public perception. The omission of history is not accidental, nor is it neutral. As we have seen, what is erased shapes how Hindu experiences are understood and remembered. This is why critical engagement with the media narratives is so important. Let's once again thank Matt McDermott for his important work in bringing these issues to light.